Hello there, and welcome to this Grammar 101 course with yours truly, Fergus Fadden, from my website, integratedskillsacademy.com. You can contact me at fergustrainer@gmail.com for one-to-one consultations for teacher training and exam preparation English language courses. Before we jump into this lesson, let me just remind you, if you can find me on all the usual social media, so Twitter at Fergus Teacher, Facebook at Integrated Skills, that's a Facebook page I have. You can also find me on Instagram at Integrated Skills ESL. And as I mentioned, you can email me at fergustrainer@gmail.com. So without further ado, let's jump into lesson 1.2, parts of speech. And in this lesson, we are going to talk about verbs. So verbs, what are verbs? Well, a verb is a word that expresses physical action. So for example, to swim or to write or to climb. It could be a mental action. That would be something like to think or to guess or to consider. It could also be a state of being, so that's something like to be or not to be, to exist or to appear. You might find it useful to think about verbs as doing words. So, what kinds of verbs are there? Well, there are, as I mentioned, there are action verbs, stative verbs, there are transitive verbs, and there are intransitive verbs, there are auxiliary verbs, we also have modal verbs, and we have phrasal verbs. So let's jump into it and explore all these kinds of verbs. So let's first of all think about an action verb. Let's look at an example. So Lee eats a cake. So this is expressing the action of eating cake. Some other examples of these kinds of physical actions could be something like she sells clothes. In this example, the word sells is a verb. It expresses the physical activity to sell. It could also be something like the doctor wrote the prescription. In that example, the word wrote is a verb. It expresses the physical activity to write. And you could also think about another one like buy a ticket. That in that case, buy is the physical activity of buying. Verbs expressing a state of being, or a state of verb. Let's look at an example there. So, I am at home. So, a state of verb expresses a state rather than an action. A state of verb typically relates to a state of being, a thought or an emotion. Some other examples that occur to me would be something like she believes in God, or he feels elated. Let's move on to this next term, which is the transitive verb. So an example could be I saw the dog. Really, what a transitive verb is, it's one that acts on something. Or another way of putting that is that it has a direct object. So the object of the scene, in this case, is the dog. It's worth noting that the direct object of a transitive verb can be found by finding the verb and asking what. For example, saw what? In that case, it's the dog. It's a good little trick that we can use as teachers to ask ourselves, is it transitive or intransitive when we're called upon to do something like that in class. So then conversely, what would an intransitive verb be? Well, those are verbs that do not actually act on something as opposed to transitive verbs, which do act on something. So an example could be the rain fell. Okay, it doesn't matter that the rain fell on the ground. It's just enough to say that the rain fell. Okay, another one could be my throat hurts. It doesn't, it's implied that it hurts me. You don't. It doesn't need to have something that the verb itself acts on. Or I sneezed. You definitely don't want to think about what you sneeze on. It's just enough to say that you sneeze. So moving on then, auxiliary verbs. This is one that you're definitely going to come across a lot, especially when you're teaching those lower levels all the way up to intermediate. And it's going to be a big part of your grammar teaching. So an auxiliary verb, here's an example of one. Lee has eaten all the pies. So an auxiliary verb, or sometimes it's referred to as a helping verb. This is one that accompanies the main verb and helps to express tense or voice or mood. The most common auxiliary verbs are be, do, and have in their various forms. So in this example, what Lee has eaten all the pies, it's helping us to understand the tense here, which, as many of you may know, this tense here is the present perfect. Another one could be the table has been prepared. Has and been, those are two auxiliary verbs in there for the present perfect of the passive voice. Okay, so let's move on and talk about modal verbs. So a modal verb, an example could be Lee can eat lots of pies. We know this because Lee has eaten all the pies. But speaking seriously, a modal verb is a type of auxiliary verb used to express ideas such as ability, possibility, permission, and obligation. The modal auxiliary verbs are can, could, may, might, must, ought to, shall, should, will, and would. So a few more examples would be, along with Lee can eat a lot of pies, we could say Lee might eat that pie before he gets home, or Lee may eat as many pies as he likes, or Lee should give you some of that pie given that you bought it, after all. So in each of those examples, like Lee might eat that pie, might there is expressing the idea of possibility. Or Lee may eat as many pies as he likes, and that helps us to express the idea of permission. Or if I said the last example there, Lee should give you some of that pie, given that you bought it. Here, the modal verb should helps us to express the idea of obligation. So moving on to the last one there in our list, phrasal verbs. A phrasal verb is a verb made up of more than one word, usually two words. A phrasal verb has a main verb and another word, either a preposition or more generally, we could just refer to it as a particle. The phrasal verb usually has a meaning a bit different from the main verb. So if we look at the example, a burglar will often break a window to break in. Here the phrasal verb break in means to enter legally, which is different from break, right? So the in is just modifying the root verb there. Okay, so a word on regular and irregular verbs. Broadly speaking, regular just means adding D or ED in the past forms. Let's look at some examples. So a regular verb is one that forms its simple past tense and its past participle by adding ED or D to the base form of the verb. There are some spelling rules to consider too. So for example, let's bring up a little chart that I've prepared here. So love, loved, has loved. So you see the addition of D there. Hate, hated, has hated. moved. An irregular verb is one that does not conform to this ruling. So, for example, tell, told, has told. Bleed, bled, has bled. Okay, so you see there that it doesn't conform to the ed or d rule. So, let's move on and do a little exercise. So I'm going to display on the screen three sentences, and there's something wrong with each one. So, I'm liking football. I'm going to meet my friends. So you may wish to pause, take a moment, and think about how you would explain what is wrong in each example. Okay, so for a grammar explanation, stative verbs describe a state rather than an action. They aren't usually used in present continuous form. So this is an example of where a stative verb is being used incorrectly, we could say. I like, remember what we said earlier on? I like what? Okay, so this is an example of a transitive verb. I'm going to meet my friends up. So this is an example of the misuse of a phrasal verb. Now you can say I'm going to meet up with my friends. So, you know, once you delve deeper into phrasal verbs, you'll see that some phrasal verbs you can split them up, and some phrasal verbs you can't split them up. So let's do this exercise. Where is the verb and what kind is it? So the police chased the criminal down the highway. The postman will give Sarah the letter. And I came across an interesting article today. So pause the video. Where is the verb and what kind is it? When you're ready, press play. So in the first example, the verb there is chased. That's the action, and it's an action verb. The police did the action of chasing the criminal. In the second example, the verb there is give. You may have noticed that there is an auxiliary modal verb there, but it's a transitive one because the postman will give wouldn't be enough information. It has to be give Sarah the letter. And the last one, I came across an interesting article. Well, the verb there is came across, or the infinitive would be come across. And this is a transitive phrasal verb. Right, because it would have a different meaning if there was no across. If I said I came an interesting article today, that wouldn't mean anything. But I came across means to find. Here, the verb come across cannot be separated, and the direct object is an interesting article. So therefore, that makes it a transitive phrasal verb. See there how we can combine two types of terminology to describe what we have in front of us. So that is it. Just a reminder about where you can find me on social media. I am on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. On Twitter, you can find me at Fergus Teacher. Facebook at Integrated Skills. On Instagram, I'm at Integrated Skills ESL. Please do follow me or sign up to any of those, whichever is your preferred social media, or all three of them. And please do contact me via email if you would like a consultation regarding teacher training or language exam preparation, including the Cambridge Suite and IELTS. So just to wrap up this lesson, I'll just do a little summary on what we covered in terms of verbs. So we did talk about what are verbs, and we said that, you know, they refer to physical actions, mental actions, and a state of being, sometimes referred to as the stative verbs. And there we saw some examples like be or exist or seem. We also talked about different kinds of verbs. So we saw that there are action verbs, stative verbs, transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, auxiliary verbs, modal verbs, and phrasal verbs. So thank you very much for following along on this e-learning course at the Integrated Skills Academy website. Please do continue on to the next lesson in this free e-learning course. Thank you very much.